Hey guys! Ooh, I hated that. In this video, I wanted to share tips on how to read more. How I went from reading probably 3-4 physical books in 2020, which probably were actually school books, where it's halfway through 2021 and I've already read about 50 books, so I've changed a few things. My first tip: don't have a life. I'm kidding, but also kind of not, because the panorama really made things hard to go out and do stuff, and I was kind of getting sick of social media and constantly being on it. That's just not something I want to spend all day doing. I found myself with so much free time, and I just did not know what to do with myself. And so I went back to one of my first loves, which was reading. I used to read so much, and then I found that I kind of would rather read than hang out with people, which sounds really bad, but it's the truth. I would much rather read than hang out with people sometimes. And whenever I would actually hang out with them, all I could think about is what they're gonna do, or what would happen if these characters were in my life right now. What are these characters doing right now? That sounds so bad. But the panorama just really helps bring me back into books, and I couldn't hang out with my friends anyways, so why not deep dive into books anyways? Not having a life just makes reading so much easier. It's the perfect time to read. That's all I gotta say, is I don't have a life, so I'm reading about people that do have lives. And somehow that makes me fulfilled. I'm okay with that. My second tip is to figure out what you like to read. What is your guilty pleasure? If you were a reader when you were younger, like me, what were you drawn to? Personally, for me, I loved reading fantasy books growing up, and dystopia books. I was right in that demographic when they came out, were really, really popular with Hunger Games and Divergent, and that whole era of books. That was my niche. So I would highly recommend looking for books that kind of go along with those interests. But I will say fiction is a lot easier to get started reading, because you get invested in these plot lines, invested in these characters, whereas nonfiction, it may be interesting to read, but it might not be the first thing you should pick up. Maybe you should pick up something along with it. That's also one of the things that I like to do, is read multiple books at a time. I normally try to read a fiction and maybe a nonfiction at the same time, or just 2 different books that you are not going to mess up the plot line with. It makes it so much easier, and it feels like you get reading done faster, just because you can be like, oh, I don't want to read this, but I do have this I could read. Also, unless you're like Emma Chamberlain and you randomly decide to pick up reading, I wouldn't suggest reading a 600-page book. I commend you for that. 600-page books are intimidating to me now, especially if you're already in that reading slump. I gravitated towards bigger books when I was younger, but now I kind of gravitate towards smaller books, because I kind of like feeling the accomplishment of reading all these smaller books and be like, oh yeah, I read 50 books this year already. I still read bigger books, but I feel like if you read smaller books, it'll give you the motivation to continue on to reading more books and more books and more books. But just seeing that you've accomplished one book makes the other books less intimidating. My third tip for reading more books is listening to an audiobook. Now they have audiobooks all over YouTube and Spotify, so it's really easy to find a free one if you do not want to pay for something like Audible. I personally use Libby, which is in the App Store, and you can basically use it for free as long as you have a library card, in which it's also audiobooks and regular books just on your phone. But I feel like audiobooks are a lot easier to read it sometimes because maybe you don't want to read, but like you want to read but you don't want to read. Audiobooks are nice because you don't have to look at the screen or at your book the whole time. You could be painting or drawing or cooking or driving. I have drove to class many times reading books, and I think it's a great way to pass the time. It makes you feel more productive even though you're doing stuff that you would normally already be doing. You're just adding a book onto that instead of listening to the same Olivia Rodrigo song that you've listened to a million times. Me. My fourth tip is to set a goal. This goal can be whatever you want depending on how far along you are in your reading journey. If you're just starting out, maybe only 10 pages a day. Maybe only a chapter a day. It's really just to get you into the habit of actually reading every single day. And I don't know if you're like me, but I can't read just 10 pages. You kind of get into the storyline and you're like, oh, I gotta figure out what happens. But you get into the storyline and you're like, I gotta figure out what's happening. I can't just stop here. It's getting good. So you keep on reading and you keep on reading, and then you don't want to stop. With this, you can also set aside a time to actually read every day. I prefer to do this tip right before bed. I normally set aside about an hour-ish of reading, and so I'm spending that time reading and not necessarily on my phone. I mean, you could be reading on your phone, but you're being productive. You're getting one of those things that you want done. And if you're off your phone reading, then you don't have the lights that keep you up. I think the blue lights and the phone are supposed to keep you up, and so it just makes you more tired and more ready to actually go to sleep. But it could also make you want to keep on reading, which may delay your bedtime a little bit. It's easier to set up a habit if you have that time of day that you are supposed to get stuff done, and also that goal of how long or how many pages that you want to do every day. The sixth tip, which is also our last tip, is to keep a book by you at all times or in sight, or if you want to do the bed tip, then maybe you want to put a book next to your bed. Currently, I have The Catcher in the Rye, and so I can just roll over, grab the book, and start reading. You don't really have to think about it as much. I mean, you have to get the motivation to read, but I feel like it's a lot easier to accomplish your goals if you have small habits like having a designated time or a goal each day to read and having it next to you. If it's in sight, it's a lot easier to remember to read than it would be if it was on your bookshelf still. Also, who puts a book on their bookshelf while they're currently reading it if they're not planning on coming back to it within that day? I don't know about you, but putting something on my bookshelf is a lot of work. Another example of this tip 5 and 6 together would be that I used to keep a book in my car for whenever I would go and get allergy shots, because you're supposed to wait 30 minutes after you get your shots so that you don't have allergic reaction. And so for that 30 minutes after I would get my shots, I would just sit in my car and read whatever book I was reading. It normally tended to be a nonfiction book. I normally stuck to nonfiction just so that I wouldn't lose the plot line. If you don't get allergy shots, maybe you have a lunch break. You could pop your earbuds in, bring a book out, read. I've done this multiple times. It's an easy way to get in a few lines of reading. I hope you found these tips useful and they work out for you. And if you like what you saw, like, share, subscribe, comment. You know what to do.